Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into it, taking a deep dive into the whole Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos era in the Philippines.
Ah, the Marcos regime. Now that's a complex story.
And you've brought us these excerpts from Primitivo Mijares' book, The Conjugal Dictatorship. It was published in '76.
Right, 76.
And, Mijares was up close and personal with Marcos before defecting and spilling the tea, as they say.
Yeah, he really doesn't hold back, does he? It's interesting. Right from the intro, Horace presents the book as this unfinished story. He's kind of challenging the Filipino people to write the ending themselves.
Wow. He's setting the stakes pretty high from the get-go.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, look, this isn't just history. This is an active struggle for democracy. It's really fascinating.
It really is. And then he drops this bombshell about President Nixon seeing Marcos's martial law as like a potential model for other nations.
Yeah.
And get this, he claims Imelda Marcos was like casually spilling this at a dinner party in D.C.
Can you imagine being a fly on the wall for that?
Oh, man.
I mean, whether it's entirely accurate or not, it really makes you think about the Cold War context, right?
Yeah. The global stage at the time.
The U.S. was in a tough spot, needing allies in the region, but there's allies, not always the most democratic.
Right. Not exactly walking the talk all the time. And Mijares doesn't let us forget that.
No, he doesn't.
He's very deliberate about pointing out the role of U.S. aid, suggesting that it might have actually helped keep Marcos in power, even as things were getting, well, more and more oppressive.
That's right. And that's where Mijares' own story becomes even more compelling.
It does, yeah.
Because he initially believed that Marcos was the only thing standing between the Philippines and, succumbing to communism.
Right. Unnecessary evil, maybe he thought.
Yeah, but then, as we know, he became deeply disillusioned by the brutality of the regime.
You can't help but be moved by that. I mean, this isn't just some academic writing a book. This is someone who was there right in the heart of it all and ultimately felt compelled to tell the truth.
He put it all on the line.
Absolutely. And he really goes into detail about Marcos himself.
Yes, he does.
Paints this picture of a man consumed by ambition from a very early age. He even alleges that Marcos fabricated parts of his World War II record medals, daring escapes, the whole shebang.
Yeah, and if that's true, it really calls into question his entire narrative, right?
Completely. It's like how much of what we know about Marcos is just like carefully crafted propaganda.
Exactly. It really makes you question his credibility.
Absolutely.
And it suggests this willingness to manipulate history to serve his own interests, which Mijares argues extended to the way he held on to power.
Right, because this manipulation wasn't just about personal image, it was about controlling the entire system, right?
Exactly. Mijares details how Marcos systematically dismantled democratic institutions. Talking about the free press.
The opposition.
Anyone who dared to question him was silenced, imprisoned. Think about the lengths people went to escape, like Ninoy Aquino's family fleeing to the U.S.
It gives you chills, doesn't it?
It really does. It was a time of fear and uncertainty.
It really makes you reflect on the human cost of these kinds of regimes. And it wasn't just Marcos calling the shots, was it? Mijares makes it clear that Imelda was a powerful force in her own right.
Oh, absolutely. He very pointedly uses that term, conjugal dictatorship, to highlight Imelda's active role.
Right. It wasn't just Ferdinand. It was a partnership. And her influence, especially her extravagant lifestyle, played a key role, didn't it?
It's almost like they were crafting this image, this narrative, to maintain power.
And it worked for a while, didn't it? But Mijares paints this stark picture of the Philippines under their rule: corruption, abuse of power, and just this overall climate of fear.
Right, and he was living it.
Exactly. And it just makes his decision to defect all the more powerful. He could have just stayed quiet, reaped the benefits of his position.
But he spoke out.
He did. He put everything on the line to expose what was happening.
And that's what makes his story so important, his perspective so valuable. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the courage it takes to stand up to it.
Absolutely. It's incredible to think he was willing to give all that up to speak the truth. But before he made that decision, he had a front row seat to how the regime controlled the narrative, right?
Absolutely. Don't forget, before he defected, Mijares was essentially Marcos's propaganda chief. He saw it all firsthand.
So how did they do it? Was it just brute force, or was there a more strategic element to it?
Well, Mijares describes it as a multi-layered approach, going beyond just threats and intimidation.
Okay, so like a carrot and stick kind of thing.
Exactly, yes. There were arrests, newspaper shut down, journalists living in fear. But they also used a lot of bribery, manipulation, a whole system designed to co-opt the media.
So it's not enough to just silence the critics. You have to turn them into, what, mouthpieces for the regime?
You got it. And he names some pretty big names, too.
Oh, like who?
Like Juan Ponce Enrile, who was Marcos's defense secretary, and Francisco Tatad, the information minister. Mijares suggests they were instrumental in enacting this crackdown.
Wow. It makes you wonder about their motivations, right?
Right. Were they true believers? Opportunists? Somewhere between. It's hard to say for sure.
It sounds like that whole period was a complex web of loyalties, ambitions, and, well, fear.
Absolutely. And speaking of complex figures, let's not forget about Imelda.
Right. Where does she fit into all of this?
Well, Mijares doesn't hold back on her either. He's especially critical of her and her brother, Cucoy Romualdez.
And what role did they play, according to Mijares?
He claims they used their positions to amass wealth and power, often at the expense of ordinary Filipinos.
So that whole conjugal dictatorship idea, with Imelda's influence being just as significant as Ferdinand's.
Exactly. Mijares gives us one example where Imelda allegedly pressured Marcos to crack down on the Lopez family, who controlled a huge chunk of the media at the time.
It really shows how she wasn't just some passive figurehead, doesn't it?
No, not at all. Mijares portrays her as a shrewd political operator, someone who understood how to wield power just as effectively as her husband.
It really makes you think, would things have been different without Imelda? Would the Marcos regime have looked the same?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's hard to say for sure, but there's no doubt that Imelda's influence on the regime was significant, both in terms of its policies and its public image.
Absolutely. And speaking of influence, we can't ignore the role of the United States during this period. Mijares certainly doesn't.
That's right. He's very critical of U.S. foreign policy, suggesting that they turned a blind eye to Marcos' abuses.
Because they needed the Philippines as an ally during the Cold War.
Exactly. And again, it's important to remember that Mijares is writing from his perspective, but he raises some valid points.
Yeah, it's that classic dilemma, right? Balancing national interests with, well, moral obligations.
Right. And in this case, Mijares argues that U.S. support, even if it was unintentional, ended up propping up a dictatorship.
It's a tough pill to swallow. But how did ordinary Filipinos feel about all of this? I mean, they were living through it, caught between the propaganda and the reality of life under an oppressive regime.
It's a good question. Mijares suggests that at first, people were drawn in by Marcos's promises.
He was charismatic, right?
Oh, very much so. He promised stability, progress, and I think people genuinely wanted to believe in him.
But as time went on, the cracks started to show.
Exactly. The true nature of the regime became impossible to ignore, and that's when you started to see more and more dissent.
He talks about student protests, labor strikes, even armed resistance from communist insurgents.
And as the opposition grew, so did the regime's brutality. We're talking arrests, torture, disappearances. It was a dark time.
It's easy to forget how dangerous it was to speak out against the Marcos regime.
People were risking their lives to fight for freedom and democracy.
And Mijares himself is a testament to that courage. He could have stayed silent, enjoyed a life of privilege.
But he chose to speak out.
Oh.
He chose to stand up for what he believed in, even though it meant putting himself and his family in danger.
And that resistance, as Mijares describes it, wasn't limited to just a few brave individuals.
Right, it was a groundswell, a movement that ultimately culminated in the People Power Revolution.
That iconic moment in 1986 when millions of Filipinos took to the streets to demand Marcos's ouster.
And while Mijares doesn't explicitly cover those events in the book, it was published before the revolution, you can see how the seeds of that uprising were sown during the period he writes about.
Absolutely. The fight for democracy in the Philippines didn't begin or end with Marcos.
Exactly. His regime cast a long shadow, and the country is still grappling with its legacy today.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something in the past, isn't it? It shapes who we are, how we see the world.
It's all connected.
It really is.
You know, it's funny. For all the serious stuff, all the political maneuvering and brutality, Mijares slips in these little details that reveal a really strange side of Marcos.
Oh, like what?
Well, according to Mijares, Marcos was, well, incredibly superstitious.
Superstition.
Oh, yeah, like seriously into it. Astrologers, faith healers, you name it, Marcos consulted them.
No way. Are you serious?
Yeah. Mijares claims he'd use them for big decisions, like timing things based on the stars or whatever.
You're kidding. That's wild. It's hard to imagine this dictator, who everyone's terrified of, lighting incense and consulting his horoscope.
I know, right? It's such a bizarre contrast. And it makes you wonder, did any of that actually influence his political decisions?
It makes you think, right? Like, Did he plan the whole martial law thing around his lucky numbers or something?
Who knows? But Mijares does point out that Marcos was really into symbolism, timing like he was trying to build this aura of destiny around himself.
It's almost like he wanted people to think he was, like, destined to rule.
Exactly. It just shows that even the most powerful figures, they're still human, you know?
With all their flaws and weird beliefs, it's kind of reassuring in a strange way.
It is. It makes history feel more real, more relatable.
Totally. Well, this has been fascinating. You've given us so much to think about. As we wrap things up, what would you say is, like, the biggest takeaway from the conjugal dictatorship? What should we be reflecting on?
For me, Mijares offers a really powerful warning about the dangers of unchecked power.
Right, how easily it can corrupt, even with good intentions at the start.
Exactly. And it reminds us that protecting democracy is a constant fight.
Mhm.
It's something we have to be actively engaged in.
And to never take our freedoms for granted.
Absolutely. And we can't be afraid to speak out against injustice, even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient.
It's like Machare's own story. He had to choose between his own comfort and doing what he thought was right.
Exactly. And sometimes those choices are tough, but they matter.
They do. So much of history is about those choices.
It is. And one last thing that really struck me from this book, there are always multiple sides to every story. Mijares' perspective is incredibly valuable, but it's just one perspective.
Right, and to get the full picture, we need to seek out other voices, other experiences.
Absolutely. That's how we learn and grow.
And that's how we make sure history doesn't repeat itself.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've resurfaced from our deep dive.
I think so. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through the Marcos regime. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.